Hello, thank you for attending this presentation. The title of my presentation today is Intentional Action from the I to the We. Philosophers mostly agree that in the case of solitary action, different from each other as they might be, there are some features that make at least a whole bulk of them intentional. The question I want to raise today is whether there is a parallel case to be made for collective activities. So, are some collective actions collectively intentional? And if so, how can we account for intentional action when it's not a matter of an individual acting alone, as in the solitary case, but a matter of individuals relating to one another to carry out some outcome? Do collective activities have something in common? And if so, can we account for the central features of collective intentional activities? And how would we do so? So here are some examples of collective actions. In the literature, as well as pre-theoretically, the following are taken as examples of collective action. Stadium waves and demonstrations. Those involve large groups of people that might not know one another, might be completely strangers to one another, spontaneously coordinating their actions. Actions carried out by large groups of individuals, but now within the context of an enterprise or an institution, where members have only indirect knowledge, if any, of each other, but they are acting upon procedures or rules or some instructions that they know hold for the sort of actions they are involved in. Actions of small groups, where individuals know each other very well and they plan to do something together. For example, a group of friends preparing dinner together. Finally, some spontaneous and short-lived actions that are highly coordinated. For example, a couple of individuals working together. What makes these collective actions intentional? Now, you might think, well, collective actions are not intentional in any relevant sense. They are just cases of collectively doing something together where there is no application of the idea that they are intentionally doing something together. Yet most views hold that at least some collective actions are intentional in some sort of philosophically interesting way. So what are the accounts of collective intentional action that hold this? Many of these accounts hold that we can understand what it is to do something intentionally with others, or what it is for a collective agent to do something more or less in the same way as we understand what it is for an individual to do something intentionally in the solitary case. For example, one form of functionalist view claims that this is a matter of the nature of the agents that perform the actions. These agents can be defined in terms of their states, and we can define the states of the agent in terms of their functional roles. For example, the functional roles of their intention, beliefs, and other mental states, and how they are related to action. Another sort of functionalist view claims that collective actions are intentional by satisfying some conditions that apply mutatis mutandis to the individual intentional action case as well. This is, for example, the case of Bradman analysis of shared intentional activities. Yet other views, what I call the Anscombian views, claim that collective intentional action is a matter of individuals having plural self-knowledge, whereas singular intentional action is a matter of individuals having singular self-knowledge. Yet other views deny that collective actions are intentional in the same way as individual intentional actions are intentional. They claim that collective actions are intentional in some sort of a special collective way, which it does not find application in the individual case, and vice versa. Yet, regardless of this difference, whether they think of the individual solitary case as analogous or the same type of as the collective case, the different views of collective intentional action seem to apply to some, but not all of the examples of collective action. So, for example, List and Petit, who endorse a view which falls under the first functionalist account I described, provide a very rich account of agency, which makes their view apply only to groups which have sophisticated means of decision-making and belief formation, such as the one that are part of enterprises, institutions, or states. But this leaves out examples such as stadium waves or cases of small groups or dyads who act in a spontaneous way, short-lived manner, and do not have means to make decisions or to form common beliefs or beliefs that can be attributed to them as a collective agent. Bradman analysis of show intentional action applies straightforwardly to some dyads that have shared intentions, that have plans that match, and that have common knowledge of all of this. But this does not include stadium waves or institutional cases of collective action. Those who emphasize joint commitment, such as Gilbert, who stresses that collective intentional action is different from individual intentional action, also leave out or underplay some cases of collective intentional action. For example, stadium waves or cases of dyads acting spontaneously might not fall within the category of people making joint commitments. The Enscombian view, on the other hand, has been argued to apply to face-to-face interactions in which interactants have some sort of direct communication to one another, but it's not clear that, and if so, how, this extends to other cases, as Hans Bernard Smith has argued. So maybe this is right. Maybe no account of collective intentional action generalizes to all cases. And if you think that, then you will be endorsing some form of straightforward pluralism. You will claim that these different cases simply do not have something in common that unifies them. And though that might be true, this comes at a price. The price is denying that there is a principle of intelligibility that applies to all of these cases alike. In doing that, one is unable to provide an account of these cases as cases of the same kind, as cases of collective intentional action. And that means that this account will be explanatorily poor. It would not be in the position to explain those cases as cases of the same kind, as cases of collective intentional activity. Now, what is the alternative? The standard view is to embrace some form of analysis plus a hierarchical view. How would that go? The idea is that we can take some cases and ask the following question: what do these cases have in common? We can define collective intentional action in terms of some properties that we deem sufficient or necessary and sufficient for the cases of the relevant kind. I call this a reductive strategy in that it reduces the cases to those properties that are able to explain the cases at issue. Though this strategy allows us to explain what the cases have in common, what makes them collectively intentional, it leaves out or underplays the importance of some other cases, as I already argued. Now, one way to go is to marry this analysis with a hierarchical account. The idea here would be to think of core cases as minimal core forms of collective intentionality, and of the other forms as somehow derivative from the minimal core forms. And the derivation from the minimal to the other cases will be through the addition of some features or properties that the minimal cases do not have, but the derivative cases do have. And a large number of different philosophers have endorsed a strategy like that, even if they endorse different accounts of what these minimal core forms are or what the derivative core forms are. Yet, even this hierarchical account leaves out some forms of collective intentional action, some forms that we will pre-theoretically classify as collective intentional activities. Why? Because those cases are not plausibly derived from the minimal selective form. So, for example, if you follow Bradman in thinking that shared intentional activity depends on people having shared intention and machine plans, in common knowledge of these, you would not think of stadium web cases as cases derived from those other cases. Another problem is that if there are reasons to think, that some of the derived cases, which one might think are more sophisticated, depend on capacities which are transformative, then it's not plausible to think that those work as additions to some core form, which does not in turn depend on these transformative capacities. Okay, what I want to do in the rest of my talk is to propose an alternative methodology to answer these questions. I want to answer positively to this question. Can we make justice to the idea that all the cases I listed at the beginning are cases of collective intentionality, avoiding reductionism and the problems it has, additive accounts, or as I call them, hierarchical accounts, and straightforward pluralism? I think we can. And the way to do this is to follow a methodology that does not look for necessary and sufficient conditions. This I call the paradigmatic account. The idea here is that we can characterize collective intentional actions by investigating some of its paradigmatic instances, some paradigmatic cases. But this investigation would not provide us with necessary and sufficient conditions for all cases of the same type. The cases, rather, can be thought to be paradigmatic of a certain genus of actions, in this case, the genus of collective intentional actions, and they would not be thought of as sharing an essence, something we can describe in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. Rather, they will be exemplifying a category along which other cases can be considered to belong by holding family resemblances to this, some resemblances. So what we identify is a cluster of overlapping similarities between different cases. And a number of different philosophers have followed this form of methodology, focusing on different concepts. So the concepts at issue are pattern concepts. And these concepts, unlike other concepts that can indeed be characterized in terms of underlying causal factors or essential features, are not specified in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. Instead, the focus is on paradigmatic tokens, and that focus allows us to identify an open list of characteristic features. Some cases of the concept might lack some or most of the characteristic features that others do have, and conversely, a few characteristics might and will usually suffice to be classified under that concept. How does this paradigmatic method work? Well, we first need to establish what are the paradigmatic cases. These are the cases that all parties agree fall under a relevant concept. In the case of collective intentional action, we can think of, for example, the case of friends cooking a meal together, or the case of a diet walking together. Then we have to establish some cases that clearly do not belong to the concept. These are cases that all parties agree do not follow under the relevant concept. Then we need to establish a list of debated and borderline cases, those cases that we do not agree upon, or that we agree are not clearly in or clearly out the concept. For example, some people have claimed that a mother and a child in a breastfeeding case count as sharing an intentional activity, but some other people disagree. Then we can establish what properties of the paradigmatic cases make them part of the concept. How do we do this? Well, the idea is that these properties function as criteria. They allow us to explain why the cases fall under the relevant concept. For example, the case of friends cooking a meal together falls under the relevant concept because the two parties share an understanding of the shared goal, because the two parties attribute beliefs and desires to one another, because the two parties deliberated as to how to proceed. Yet, these properties do not explain the cases. These are not reductionist properties. So they are not, for example, mechanisms that explain why the case falls under the relevant concept. The properties do not need to be the same for each case, though we might expect that they will overlap. Now we can use these properties to map the possibility space of the concept and place the various cases into the spatial representation. This will allow us to develop a picture of the phenomenon of interest that does not presuppose any particular underlying mechanism, as I explained before, that unifies the cases. In this manner, this account leaves open the possibility of multiple realizability, so that the properties that we identify as criteria might be multiply realized by different mechanisms. It's also a concept that can be revised. We might discover that we miss some important features that are important for us to underline in our research. We might want to reclassify the cases according to our interests, and so on and so forth. And very importantly, these concepts can be used to drive inquiry. So we can investigate empirically the features of these different cases. We can wonder about the mechanisms that underline the possibility of engaging in these activities. We might want to know how they work in the development, in children's development. We might want to know how they work phylogenetically. We might want to know what animals are capable of these different activities and because of which abilities. And this procedure leaves open these questions, allowing us to drive empirical inquiry. So here is representation of the conceptual space, and the color columns are the different cases, and each of the axes represents one of the characteristic features. And what you can see here is some of the cases might have the different features to different degrees. And we can have areas in the representation where we see that most of the cases fall, and what are the characteristics that are more salient of those examples. And this might allow us to see different groups of cases that share some characteristics but not others. So, to finish, I argued that actually this methodology, the paradigmatic methodology, is the best way to go. Why is this so? Because this strategy combines the best of the pluralistic approach with the best of the analysis approach. It is, as the analysis approach, explanatorily rich. Why? Because it allows us to identify core features in terms of which the paradigmatic cases of collective intentional action, those we are interested in, can be understood. But as the pluralistic approach, it also allows us to speak of a large variety of different cases. And we can even think of those cases as paradigmatic of different species and to different degrees, further or closer to the paradigmatic case. Furthermore, this methodology is neutral as to what are the core features of collective intentional action in general and in each type of case. So, being neutral about these features, it allows us to investigate conceptually and empirically what these features are, and to unify them, if this is sound, if we find that this can be done, in a core theory that speaks to all of these core features. And with this, I finish. Thank you for your attention.